Hello everybody, can you all hear me? Yeah? Good afternoon. Okay, so my name's Ruth. I'm the CEO of an organisation called In Place of War. We work with creativity in places of conflict across the world. And today I want to talk a little bit about that, but what I really want to do is try to inspire everybody in the room to go out and make change and challenge the current political climate and status quo. So I wanted to begin the talk today by talking about this guy. I don't know how many of you can see this guy. If you can't see him, then there he is, okay? Doing this remarkable thing that he does. So, of course, this is Donald Trump. And, you know, he is kind of the most important man in the world, isn't he? Or he's certainly the most influential and powerful man in the world. And he does things like this, which is quite amazing. And he says things like this. And, you know, this is the most important man in the world, right? And the thing with Donald Trump and kind of big politics is that it's everywhere, right? It's in our social media feeds, it's on our TV screens, it's in our newspapers, it's in our everyday conversations. And yet it feels really far away. It feels like, how do we affect change with this guy? In the UK, we have our own set of issues. We did this thing called Brexiting. Nobody quite knows what it means or the consequences of it. And I think I've probably said the word Brexit maybe like 1 million times since it was invented. It's all over the TV, it's all over the newspapers. It's being led by this woman here. She's gonna lead us through a really good Brexit deal, dancing her way through it. And you know, again, these things feel like they're everywhere around us, but how do we affect any change? What agency do we have? And the question that I propose to you guys is, what did you do? What did you do about this guy? What did you do about Donald Trump? What did you do about Brexit? What are you doing about the things that are affecting your everyday lives? Brexit will affect everybody in this room more than any other demographic in the country. What are you doing about it? I remember when I was your age and I could vote for the first time, and I voted for Tony Blair, and I felt like this is amazing, things are going to be brilliant. And very shortly after that, my thoughts were shattered. He introduced tuition fees, which I thought was a terrible thing, and then he decided to wage a war on Iraq. And I remember getting on a bus and going down to London and being really positive and thinking, right, there's loads of me, my friends, loads of people marching, taking to the streets. We're going to make change here. We're going to stop this war. Walking through the streets of London, coming back feeling so positive. And yet the war still happened, and I thought, you know, we live in a democracy, and it felt like millions of people took to the streets that day, showing that they didn't want that to happen, and yet it still did. So for me, it was kind of like, well, what was the point? How can we affect change? How can we make these guys not do the things that we don't want them to do? What can we do? And I became really apathetic. And luckily, I have this really brilliant job where I get to travel around the world and meet people in very different circumstances than we're in this room. We're in this beautiful building, and we go outside, and we've got this incredible infrastructure in Manchester, and this is across the whole of the country. We have great roads, transport systems, we have restaurants and bars. And what I want to do today is talk about 5 people who don't have that. And yet what they do is remarkable, and the change that they're making in their communities, for me, inspires me to do what I do and to keep going and to know that you can make change when you don't have very much. And we've got a lot, so the change that we could make could be huge. So I'm going to talk about 5 people quite quickly. First of all, and they're all friends of mine, and I love them very much, and I think what they do is remarkable. So this is Benny. So Benny is based in Uganda, in the north of Uganda, in a place called Kitgum. And the north of Uganda had decades of civil war. Benny had to flee his community and go and live in a refugee camp. And he said that when he was in his village, he could hear the soldiers coming, and when you could hear the soldiers coming from the Lord's Resistance Army, he said everyone in the village, without saying anything to each other, would flee. They would run into the bush, run away, on their own, run and run. And he was a kid when this was happening, he was really young. And he said, you'd run into the bush, and then you'd take some steps, and then you'd kind of then you'd retrace your steps, and you'd hide. and you'd hide for hours and hours and hours. And then eventually, when you felt like it might be safe to return to the village, you'd go back, and people would walk back to the village, but not everyone would come back. And that was his reality. After the war, Benny had to go back to his community and rebuild their lives. And this is very rural Uganda, an area of extreme poverty. And what Benny did is quite remarkable. He loves hip-hop. So him and a bunch of his friends who all make hip-hop set up a hip-hop agri-business. Okay? So they set up a farm, they keep bees, they grow produce and make hip-hop. And the profit they make from the produce that they sell enables them to go into their local prison and deliver hip-hop with people in the prison, which in turn means that the people who are going through this cycle of going to prison and going out and then reoffending and going back in, once they've gone through his hip-hop process, they don't end up going back to prison. They come and they find him and they join his collective. So for me, Benny, just with himself and hip-hop and this idea of kind of creating this farm, has made massive change. Benny reckons that he works with about 6,000 young people in his community, across the communities, every year making change, with nothing. The next person I want to talk about is a guy called Vijay. He's not on this picture, but this is a picture of his work. So Vijay's from this really, really unique community. It's a travelling community based in India, and they're an artistic community. So basically, they would move across India with puppets, with dance, with music, and they would make their living from performing in front of other people as they travelled. When they got to Delhi, they decided that they wanted to settle in Delhi, and they set up an informal camp. This was about 50 years ago, and the camp grew, and now it's thousands and thousands of people in a kind of informal settlement in Delhi, or what you would see as a slum. One day, the Delhi Development Authority decided to demolish his community. And what they wanted to do was rehouse everybody in these high-rise blocks of flats. And Vijay said to me, he was like, no one's talked to us about this process. And he was like, how are we going to house our 70-foot puppets? How are we going to create a workshop where we can make our ouds? And he said, our art runs through our entire community, but no one's talked to us about this rehousing. And so what he decided to do with his community was take to the streets and protest, but using art as the protest. So they took the 70-foot puppets and they went on the streets. And because of the use of art, the media became really interested in what they were doing. And this community that had no voice, this community in India in the caste system are viewed as criminals. So they would never ever get any kind of media space. But because of the uniqueness of their art protest, as he calls it, they made the front page of every single newspaper in India the next day. And the demolition people withdrew, the police withdrew, and then that opened up a space where Vijay could have a conversation, and they won. They got to create the space with the place for the 70-foot puppets. They got to do it on their terms. And the tool that enabled them to do that was art. So for me, this is a really remarkable guy, but also the use of art is quite phenomenal. This is a woman called African Woman Arise, or AWA. She's from Zimbabwe, so obviously you'll probably know quite a bit about Zimbabwe, the political oppressed Zimbabwe who had the same president for 37 years, which is phenomenal. She's from a community where domestic violence, rape and conflict is frequent, and opportunities, particularly for women, are really limited. Women don't really have any kind of voice. Where she lives, there's a 98% unemployment rate in her community, so you can imagine all of the problems that go with that. And in her community, as a woman, she's expected not to work, but to live in the home and to bring up children and so on. You know, she wanted to speak out about this, and she again used hip-hop as the tool to do that. When I first met Awa, I was by accident in an event in her community, a hip-hop event, and all day there were guys taken to the stage doing their hip-hop, and there was all guys in the audience, no women. And this guy came over to me and he said, in a minute, a woman's going to come and perform. I was like, there's just no way that that's going to be possible. This just that can't happen. And she came out, she wears traditional indigenous clothing, and she walked onto the stage and she threw herself on the floor and she reenacted this kind of scene of domestic violence, and then she rapped. And it was amazing because every guy in there gave her complete respect. And what she was talking about was domestic abuse to a bunch of guys. So what hip-hop did for her is gave her a voice and enabled her to have a conversation with guys that she would never have been able to have without it. So again, hip-hop making a real change. This is a guy called Alejandro. He's from a city called Medellin in Colombia. You may know this city because there's a program called Narcos, which talks about some of the violence that's taken place in that city due to the drug cocaine. So there's a lot of gang violence there. If you're a young person like Alejandro, your opportunities are really limited, and they're limited to basically being in a gang and having a violent reality. Between 10 years in Medellin, 40,000 young people were murdered in the city. And there's a saying that is, we were born to die in Medellin. Young people expect to live only till about the age of 21, which is incredibly sad. Alejandro said that when he was a kid, he saw his neighbour being killed on a balcony as he watched when he was 12 years old. And he said the sound of gunfire is so frequent that he can't hear it anymore. But in this city, young people wanted to make a change, and they were really inspired by hip-hop in New York and what that did for black people in New York and giving them the kind of empowerment and a voice. And they decided to, in Medellin, kind of create this hip-hop movement. It started quite simply with people breakdancing on the streets, and it grew and grew and grew. And now there are 2,500 hip-hop crews across the city of Medellin. Wherever you go in the city, you can see hip-hop. It's amazing. And hip-hop has really transformed opportunities for young people. If you make hip-hop, you are not in a gang. And before there was no other alternative, you just had to be in a gang. And hip-hop now gives people a voice and gives people an alternative. And a lot of people like Alejandro and a lot of the people that I know that were in gangs in Medellin have now got decent jobs. They now have different futures. And basically, hip-hop opens an opportunity for that. My friend MC Looper says, if it wasn't for hip-hop, I would be dead. Hip-hop gave me another option, and I'm truly thankful for that. And for me, the idea of hip-hop saving someone's life is quite an incredible thing. But that's just echoed around Medellin and around the world. And finally, I want to talk about these three guys. So this is Mohammed, Taisiya, and Mayen. And they're based in Palestine. These guys probably have had the worst of all the lives of all the people. So they've seen loads of their friends be murdered quite brutally by soldiers in their village. So they live in this village called Kalandia, which is sort of no man's land. They don't really have any identity. They can't move from where they're from. They are restricted to their village. They can't move around. There's checkpoints everywhere, and they have no identity. They've seen their friends be killed by soldiers storming the village. And so they make hip-hop, again. Their studio is a stone's throw away from the biggest checkpoint in Palestine. It's huge. And their studio is literally, you walk out of the door and there's the checkpoint. And hip-hop gives them this kind of real voice, and it makes them feel a sense of self-preservation and empowerment. What hip-hop is to them, they're never going to be, hugely famous hip-hop artists. Maybe they will be. But what hip-hop does is it gives them hope. Through hip-hop, they bring together this community of people who are talking about what's happening, spreading their messages in a really positive way. A few weeks ago, they were in their studio, and they're really good, they're amazing. They're in their studio doing their thing, and they opened the door to leave the studio, and somebody or some people had poured cement across the whole of the front of their building, and they couldn't get out. And it took days and days for them to be dug out of their studio. But they still return to their studio, and they still make hip-hop because it's so important to them. So they're my 5 examples of people who are really quite remarkable, but people who are using art to make change. And I think that's a really powerful thing that we can all do. We all have access to lots of things, but when we use art and creativity, it really works in terms of making change. In Place of War, really quickly, so the organisation that I work with, we work with creativity and we support all of the people that I've just talked about. We do things like help them build cultural spaces, we help foster artistic collaboration, and we provide education tools, and we help them amplify the impact of their amazing work. We work in all of the places I've just talked about, so places of war, post-war, gang war, and political oppression. And for me, our work is a kind of complementary to the amazing work that these guys are already doing. So I guess kind of wanted to end, I didn't really plan the end, but I just wanted to end with a question, and the question is, so what will you do? What will you do to challenge the situation that we have in the world at the moment. I've talked about the US and the UK, but every country seems to be shifting towards the right. You know, the same in Brazil with a coup, you know, the same in Sweden. Everything is shifting. And we need to respond to that. And I think probably, I'm writing a book, and I did an interview with this guy called Dan Glass, who's my favourite activist in the UK. He's amazing, right? And he said this really interesting thing to me. He was like, you know, activism doesn't have to be about, you know, big protests and, you know, everybody coming together and doing these huge things. Activism can literally be about going and making someone a cup of tea. You know, Sandra down the street that you hardly talk to, but you see her every day and say hi. Go and make her a cup of tea, because people like this don't want you to be connected to Sandra and other people in your community. When you start to be connected to people on your doorstep, that can have a really big impact on the world around you and the change that's possible. So I would say, you know, go and make Sandra a cup of tea, but also think about how maybe you can use art and creativity to make change in your communities. Don't forget about this guy. It doesn't matter. We can't do anything, can we? You know, but we can make change in our communities and in the places that we are. And I just wanted to leave again. I'm going to finish now with this remarkable gif of Theresa May dancing African. Thank you very much.